Daniel was an ordinary man who lived a simple life. He was not rich, not famous, and not someone who stood out in a crowd. But he had a strong heart, and that was something everyone who knew him would agree on. He lived with his family in a small house on the edge of the city. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he would wake up, wash his face, drink a quick cup of tea, and leave for work. His job was not easy. He worked at a construction site where lifting heavy things, climbing ladders, and standing for long hours was part of his daily routine. Still, he never complained. He did it because his family needed him, and because he believed that hard work was the only honest way forward in life. On that particular day, Daniel was more tired than usual. The project at the construction site had been difficult, and the heat of the day had drained his energy. By the time evening came, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his muscles ached. But even then, he smiled as he thought about going home. His mother had promised to cook his favorite meal, and he was looking forward to eating with his younger brother, who always shared stories about school. Daniel was the kind of person who found joy in small things. He didn't need much, just the comfort of his family and the peace of knowing he had done an honest day's work. He walked to the parking area and saw his old motorbike waiting for him. That bike had been with him for years. It was not fast, not new, and often gave him trouble, but Daniel trusted it. He put on his helmet, started the engine, and began his ride back home. The road was wet because it had rained earlier. The air smelled fresh, but the surface of the road was slippery. He knew he had to be careful, but he was also tired and just wanted to reach home quickly. As he rode, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows on the empty road. For a while, everything seemed normal. The city traffic was lighter than usual because of the rain, and Daniel thought to himself how nice it felt to ride in the cool breeze. But as he approached a sharp turn, the unexpected happened. A small car coming from the opposite direction swerved suddenly to avoid a pothole. The driver did not notice Daniel in time. Daniel tried to turn his bike sharply to avoid the car, but the wet road betrayed him. His tires slipped, and in a matter of seconds, he lost control. The motorbike skidded and Daniel's body was thrown to the side. He crashed hard into a roadside barrier with a sickening thud. His helmet cracked against the edge of the barrier, and his body twisted in ways that no human body should. The sound of the crash echoed in the empty street, and then there was silence. For a few moments, Daniel did not move. The bike lay a few feet away, its engine still sputtering before it finally went quiet. Blood trickled down his forehead and his breathing grew shallow. Pain shot through his body like fire, but his mind was slipping into darkness. His last thought before he fainted was of his mother's smile waiting at home. Some nearby shopkeepers and passers-by heard the crash and rushed toward the scene. When they saw Daniel lying motionless by the road, panic spread among them. One man bent down and checked if he was breathing. "He's alive!" he shouted, and everyone else hurried to help. Some people lifted him gently while another person dialed the emergency number for an ambulance. His legs looked bent at odd angles, and his arms seemed broken. Even for those who had seen accidents before, this one looked terrible. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived with its siren cutting through the night air. The paramedics quickly placed Daniel on a stretcher and into the vehicle. The people who had gathered watched with worried faces. Some whispered prayers, while others shook their heads thinking he might not survive. The ambulance sped away, its red lights flashing as it raced toward the hospital. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly. They placed an oxygen mask on Daniel, checked his pulse, and tried to stop the bleeding. His body trembled with every bump in the road. Though unconscious, he let out a faint groan, showing he was still fighting. One of the paramedics whispered, "Stay with us, just hold on." When the ambulance reached the hospital, doctors and nurses were already prepared. They rushed him into the emergency room and began examining him. One doctor checked his breathing, while another looked at the injuries. His clothes were cut open to see the extent of damage. The nurses worked to clean the wounds and prepare him for scans. After an initial examination, the doctors were shocked. His ribs were broken, his left leg was shattered, his arms were fractured, and even his collarbone seemed damaged. It was clear that he had suffered multiple serious injuries. The doctors ordered an immediate scan to count the fractures and check for internal damage. The machines beeped and buzzed as they captured images of his broken body. The results left the team speechless. 17 fractures, 17 different breaks across his ribs, legs, arms, and shoulders. They had never seen someone with that many fractures who was still alive and breathing on his own. Outside the emergency room, Daniel's family arrived after receiving a phone call. His younger brother was in tears, refusing to believe what had happened. His mother's hands trembled as she prayed, asking for her son's safety. Neighbors who had come with them tried to comfort the family, but the fear in their eyes was clear. Inside the room, Daniel stirred and slowly opened his eyes for a moment. The bright hospital lights stung, and the pain made him gasp, but he was alive. The doctors leaned close to check if he could speak. They asked him, "Do you know where you are? Do you know what happened?" Daniel blinked weakly, tried to form words, and with a faint, almost unbelievable smile whispered, "I've had worse." The medical staff looked at each other in shock. How could someone with so many fractures say such a thing? To them, it was almost impossible. But for Daniel, it was his way of showing he was not ready to give up. He had always been strong, and, even now, lying broken on the hospital bed, he wanted to remind himself and everyone else that his spirit was not broken. The night grew heavy as the doctors prepared for emergency surgeries. His family waited outside, holding on to hope. Daniel lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, his words echoing in the minds of those who heard them. "I've had worse." It was hard to believe, but those words were the beginning of a story that no one would forget. The night after the accident felt endless for Daniel's family. His mother sat outside the emergency room, whispering prayers under her breath, her eyes red from crying. His younger brother paced back and forth, unable to sit still, clenching his fist tightly as if his anger and worry could somehow keep Daniel safe. The doctors had explained that his condition was very serious. They needed to stabilize him first before they could even think about surgery. The words, 17 fractures, kept echoing in everyone's minds. It was a number that sounded unreal. Inside the intensive care unit, doctors worked carefully. They placed Daniel on machines to monitor his heart and breathing. Needles were attached to his arms, tubes helped deliver medicine and fluids, and his body was covered in bandages. When the head doctor came out to speak with the family, he looked tired but calm. "He is alive," he said. "But his injuries are severe. We need to operate in stages. There are fractures in his ribs, arms, and legs. It will take time and it will not be easy. But for now, he is fighting." Hearing those words, his mother nodded with tears running down her face. She whispered softly, "My son is strong. He has been fighting since he was a child. He will not give up now." His brother, though shaken, clenched his jaw and said, "He will make it, I know he will." The first night was the hardest. Machines beeped steadily. Doctors and nurses came in and out, and Daniel drifted between moments of half-consciousness and deep sleep. Each time he opened his eyes, the pain was unbearable, but he never screamed. Instead, he would look at the nurse or doctor and try to smile. When one nurse asked if he understood how serious his condition was, he whispered again, "I've had worse." The staff were surprised. Most patients with such injuries would be terrified, begging for relief, or crying out in pain. But here was a man whose body was broken in 17 places, and yet his spirit seemed untouched. The doctors soon began to learn more about Daniel's past. His family told them how he had grown up facing hardship. His father had passed away when Daniel was very young, leaving him as the eldest son with the responsibility of supporting the family. He had worked since his teenage years, selling small items on the streets, helping at shops, and later taking tough labor jobs just to put food on the table. Life had never been kind to him, but he had never once complained. He had seen his mother cry when they could not afford school fees or proper medicine, and that had made him stronger. He often told his younger brother, "Pain is not the end. It just teaches us how strong we are." When the doctors heard this, they began to understand why Daniel could say those strange words after such a terrible accident. His body may have been fragile in that moment, but his mind was trained to fight through suffering. The next morning, scans confirmed the full extent of the damage. Both his arms had fractures, one leg was shattered, and his ribs were cracked in multiple places. The collarbone was broken and his back showed signs of strain. The medical team gathered and made a plan. They could not fix everything at once. It would be too dangerous. Instead, they would perform several operations over the coming weeks, focusing first on the most life-threatening injuries. When his family was told about the surgeries, fear grew in their hearts. Surgery always carried risks, and in Daniel's case, the risks were much higher. But Daniel himself, weak as he was, looked at his mother and said softly, "Don't worry, I'll come back. I've had worse." His words brought tears to her eyes, but they also gave her courage. As days passed, more people from Daniel's neighborhood came to visit the hospital. Friends, co-workers, and even neighbors he had helped in the past all came to ask about his condition. They remembered the times he had repaired something for free, or given food to someone in need, or stood up for a person being treated unfairly. Everyone said the same thing. If anyone can survive this, it's Daniel. Inside the ICU, Daniel's bed became a place of both suffering and inspiration. Nurses noticed that even when the pain was unbearable, he tried to make light jokes. When a nurse carefully adjusted his arm, he winced but whispered, "I've been through worse at work when bricks fell on me." When another nurse checked his ribs, he groaned but smiled, saying, "Feels like I wrestled with an elephant, but I'll be fine." His sense of humor, even in the darkest moments, touched everyone. At night, when the lights dimmed and most patients rested quietly, Daniel sometimes opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. Memories of his past hardships would return to him. He remembered walking long distances with heavy loads just to earn a little money. He remembered days when he went without food so his brother could eat. He remembered working through fevers and injuries because his family needed him. Each memory reminded him that he had survived before, and he could survive again. His mother often sat beside him, holding his hand gently. She would whisper, "You are my strength, my son. Please keep fighting." He would squeeze her hand weakly and whisper back, "I'm not going anywhere." His brother, though younger, tried to appear strong. He would tell Daniel stories from school or talk about little things at home, just to keep him distracted from the pain. Sometimes Daniel laughed, softly, and that small sound filled the room with hope. The doctors noticed his unusual spirit and began to respect him deeply. One senior doctor remarked, "This man is teaching us that healing is not only about medicine, it is also about courage." Another doctor nodded and said, "Every time he says, 'I've had worse,' it feels like he is reminding us of the power of the human will." Still, the road ahead was not easy. The medical team had to prepare carefully for the first major surgery. Plates and screws would be used to repair the broken bones. It would take hours and recovery would be long. Daniel listened quietly as the doctors explained. Then, with a calm expression, he said, "Do what you must. I'll handle the pain." Night before the surgery, his family gathered around his bed. His mother kissed his forehead and prayed over him. His brother held his hand tightly, refusing to let go. Friends who were allowed a short visit stood by the doorway, whispering words of encouragement. Daniel looked at them all, and though weak, gave them a smile. "Don't worry," he said softly. "This is just another challenge. I've faced worse storms than this." As the hospital lights glowed quietly in the night, Daniel closed his eyes, ready for what was to come. His body may have been broken in 17 places, but his heart was unshaken. His story was just beginning, and everyone who knew him could feel that he was about to show them what true strength meant. The day of Daniel's first major operation arrived like a heavy storm that everyone had been waiting for. Nurses prepared the room, doctors reviewed the scans one last time, and his family stood outside with hands folded in prayer. The hallway was filled with an air of tension. For most patients, a single surgery would have been enough to shake the courage of loved ones. But in Daniel's case, this was only the beginning. His body was like a broken puzzle, and the doctors had to carefully put the pieces back together, one operation at a time. As they wheeled him toward the operating theater, Daniel turned his head slightly and caught sight of his mother and brother waiting by the door. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Don't cry," he whispered softly. "This is nothing. I'll be back soon. I've had worse." His voice was weak, but his words carried strength. The staff who pushed his stretcher exchanged surprised looks, wondering how a man in such condition could still speak with such calmness. The surgery began. Bright lights shone overhead and the sound of metal instruments echoed in the silent room. Surgeons worked tirelessly for hours. They placed steel plates along his shattered leg, tightened screws into his broken bones, and carefully aligned fractures that seemed impossible to fix. Sweat formed on the doctor's brows, but they refused to stop. They knew Daniel had a will like no other, and they wanted to give him the best chance to walk again. After long hours, the first surgery was declared successful. When Daniel woke up hours later, his body was filled with pain. Every breath felt heavy, every movement sent waves of fire through his bones. Yet when the doctor leaned over and asked how he was feeling, Daniel blinked slowly and whispered, "Feels like a truck ran over me, but I'll live. I've had worse." The doctor chuckled softly, shaking his head, amazed by the man's spirit. The days that followed were filled with challenges. Daniel had to go through more surgeries, each one as demanding as the last. Metal rods were fixed inside his arms, screws tightened his collarbone, and broken ribs were supported carefully. Each time he went into the operating room, his family's hearts trembled, but Daniel remained steady. Before every surgery, he would give a half smile and say the same words, "I'll be fine. I've had worse." His words became a kind of shield for his family, protecting them from drowning in fear. Recovery was not easy. His body was covered with scars, stitches, and bandages. Machines beeped constantly around him. He could not move without help, and every small action required assistance. But his determination never faded. Nurses would find him awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling but not complaining. When asked if he needed more medicine, he would often say, "Pain is part of healing. Don't worry about me." The hospital staff began to notice how different Daniel was from other patients. Some people cried out in pain, some begged for more medicine, and some even gave up hope. But Daniel remained steady, holding on to life with quiet strength. Soon other patients in the ward began to hear about him. They whispered stories about the man with 17 fractures who still smiles. Visitors who passed by his bed often stopped just to look at him with curiosity and admiration. One afternoon, a nurse entered the room with a tray of food. She placed it gently on the table beside him and said, "You really inspire everyone here. Even with all these injuries, you keep saying you've had worse. How can you be so calm?" Daniel looked at her, his face pale but his eyes shining. "Because pain doesn't scare me," he said slowly. "Life has already tested me in so many ways. This is just another test. If I survived before, I can survive this too." The nurse nodded, unable to stop her tears. She realized that his strength was not only in his body but deep within his heart. His friends came to visit as soon as the hospital allowed. They were shocked when they first saw him, lying in bed with tubes and bandages. Some couldn't hold back their emotions. One of his close friends whispered, "How can you still smile in this condition, Daniel?" He gave a weak laugh. "If I don't smile, then what else can I do? Crying won't fix my bones. At least a smile gives me hope." His words silenced the room, and soon everyone joined him with small smiles, encouraged by his spirit. The doctors explained that his recovery would be long. He might never run again, and walking without help would take years of therapy. When they told Daniel this, he didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded and said, "Then I'll learn to walk again step by step. I've had worse journeys." The doctors exchanged glances, knowing that if anyone could achieve the impossible, it was him. Weeks passed, and Daniel slowly adjusted to his new reality. Each morning, nurses helped him sit up, though it felt like his body was breaking all over again. Every breath hurt, every movement was a battle, but he never refused. When asked if he wanted to rest, he would shake his head. "No," he would say. "The sooner I move, the sooner I heal." His determination began to influence others in the ward. Patients who had given up started to try harder after seeing him. A man with a broken spine whispered, "If Daniel can do it, maybe I can too." A woman recovering from surgery said, "His strength gives me strength." Without realizing it, Daniel had become a leader in that ward, giving courage to people who had lost hope. At night, when his family was allowed to visit, the atmosphere around his bed was different from the rest of the hospital. His mother would sit close, gently brushing his hair with her fingers. His brother often cracked small jokes to lighten the mood. Daniel, though in pain, laughed softly, creating warmth in the room. Neighbors who came to check on him always left saying, "He's not just healing himself, he's healing all of us with his spirit." One evening after a long day of therapy and checkups, a young doctor sat by his side. "Do you know what people are saying about you, Daniel?" the doctor asked. Daniel shook his head. The doctor smiled. "They say you are not just a patient. You are a teacher. You're teaching us what it means to be strong." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "I don't want to be a hero. I just want to go home to my family. But if my fight helps someone else, then maybe that is the reason I'm still alive." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's progress amazed everyone. He could move his fingers again, wiggle his toes, and even sit for short periods without help. These small victories brought joy to his family and pride to the medical team. Every step of progress, no matter how tiny, was celebrated like a festival. Though the pain never fully left him, Daniel accepted it as part of his journey. "Pain means I'm alive," he said one day with a grin. "And as long as I'm alive, I can fight." His words became a mantra for everyone around him. Nurses wrote it on the whiteboard in the ward. "As long as we are alive, we can fight." Patients and staff alike repeated it whenever they felt weak. In those long weeks of surgeries and healing, Daniel's story spread beyond the hospital. People from his neighborhood told others about the man who survived 17 fractures and still smiled. Strangers began sending small gifts and letters of encouragement. Some sent flowers. Others wrote messages of strength. The hospital became a place where Daniel's story lifted not just the people inside, but even those outside who heard about him. And through it all, Daniel remained humble. He never once called himself strong. He always said, "I'm just living, I've had worse, this is only another challenge." But everyone around him knew the truth. His courage was extraordinary, and his story was only growing stronger with each passing day. After months inside the hospital, the day finally came when Daniel was transferred to a rehabilitation center. His body had been pieced back together by doctors through countless surgeries, but now came the hardest part, the fight to move again. The hospital saved his life, but the rehabilitation center would decide what kind of life he could live. When he first arrived, he was wheeled into a bright hall where other patients were also recovering. Some were older, some younger, but all had their own battles. Some had crutches, some were in wheelchairs, and others were learning to walk with braces. Daniel looked around and realized he was not alone in his struggle. But unlike many of the others, he carried 17 fractures inside his body. Plates, screws, and rods held his bones together. His muscles were stiff, his body weak, and simple actions like raising a hand or bending a knee felt impossible. On his first morning at the center, a physiotherapist named Kareem introduced himself. "You will not like me," Kareem said with a smile, "because I will push you harder than you want. But remember, I am here to help you walk again." Daniel gave a tired laugh. "I already don't like you," he joked, though his voice was soft. That was Daniel's way, humor even in pain. The first exercise was simple, sitting up on the edge of the bed without support. For most people, it would take seconds. For Daniel, it felt like climbing a mountain. Sweat covered his face, his arms trembled, and sharp pain shot through his ribs as he tried to straighten his back. Every part of his body screamed at him to lie down again. But he refused. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself upright until he was sitting, chest rising and falling heavily. The therapists clapped softly. "Good," Kareem said. "That's the beginning." Daniel managed to smile. "If this is the beginning, I can't imagine the end." Day after day, the therapy grew harder. First, learning to move his arms without tearing the stitches. Then, lifting his legs an inch off the bed, later standing with support, even if only for a few seconds. Every exercise was a battle. Sometimes he cried silently from the pain, but he never allowed himself to quit. Whenever the therapists asked if he wanted to rest, he shook his head and muttered, "Pain means progress, let's continue." The other patients began noticing him. They saw how he fought through each exercise without giving up. Some who had lost hope found new strength watching him. One man with a spinal injury said, "If Daniel can fight with 17 fractures, I can try too." A woman learning to walk with a brace whispered to her daughter, "Look at that man. He is proof that strength comes from the heart." Without realizing it, Daniel had become a source of inspiration in the rehabilitation center, just as he had been in the hospital. But the road was far from smooth. Some days his body simply refused to cooperate. He would try to take a step and his leg would buckle. He would attempt to lift his arm, and the pain would force him back down. These failures tested him deeply. One evening, after a particularly difficult session where he could not complete the exercises, he sat silently by the window, staring at the rain. His mother, who stayed nearby, came and sat beside him. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "If I give up now, all the surgeries, all the struggles will mean nothing." His mother gently held his hand. "Even heroes need rest. You are not weak for feeling tired." Those words comforted him, and he allowed himself a few quiet tears. But the next morning, he was back in the therapy room, ready to fight again. Weeks turned into months. With the help of crutches, Daniel took his first steps across the room. Everyone present applauded. The physiotherapist smiled with pride, his family cried with joy, and Daniel, exhausted but happy, whispered, "I told you I've had worse." Those first steps were small, shaky, and slow, but to him, they were proof that he was winning the war. The center soon became like a second home. Daniel encouraged other patients, shared jokes during therapy, and often repeated his favorite line whenever someone complained of pain. "At least it's not 17 fractures." The laughter this created lightened the heavy mood of the place. His positivity spread like fire, and the rehabilitation center slowly transformed from a place of suffering into a place of hope. Even the staff admired him. One therapist told new patients, "If you think your pain is too much, look at Daniel. He teaches us that the human spirit is stronger than steel." Another nurse said, "He doesn't just heal his body, he heals the hearts around him." Months later, Daniel was finally able to walk without crutches, though with a slight limp. It was not a perfect walk, but it was his walk earned through sweat, tears, and endless effort. He had turned his broken body into a living story of courage, and while his scars and pain would always remain, so too would his strength. A full year had passed since the accident, and the day finally came when Daniel was allowed to return home. He walked out of the rehabilitation center slowly, each step steady but filled with pride. His mother stood waiting outside with tears of joy streaming down her face. His younger brother ran to hug him carefully, afraid of hurting him, but unable to hold back his excitement. Daniel looked at them both and smiled, whispering, "I told you I'd come back." When he entered his neighborhood, people gathered to welcome him. Neighbors who had prayed for him during the long months came forward with smiles, handshakes, and warm words. Children looked up at him with awe, hearing stories about the man who survived 17 fractures. To them, he was like a living legend. Daniel, humble as always, shook his head and said, "I'm no hero. I just didn't give up." Life at home was different from before. He could not lift heavy objects as he once did, and his limp reminded him daily of the accident. But he adapted. He helped his family in smaller ways, doing what he could without straining himself. Every morning he practiced simple exercises to keep his body strong. The pain never fully disappeared. On rainy days, his bones ached sharply. But instead of complaining, he accepted it as part of his story. "These pains," he said once, "are reminders that I survived." As time went on, Daniel began visiting schools and community centers to share his experience. He spoke not with grand speeches, but with simple words from the heart. "I was broken 17 times, he would say, but not once did I let my spirit break. Pain is real, but so is courage. If I can fight, you can too." His talks inspired young students to believe in themselves and encouraged struggling workers to keep going despite hardships. One day he was invited to speak at a hospital where new patients were recovering from accidents. When he entered the ward, many of them stared at him in disbelief. They had heard about him, but seeing him walk in person, with a smile and strong voice, gave them hope. "I know what you are feeling," Daniel told them gently. "I know the nights are long and the pain feels endless. But if you fight today, tomorrow will be better, and one day you will stand again just like me." The patients listened, some with tears, some with renewed determination. He had become living proof that healing was possible. His reputation spread far beyond his neighborhood. Newspapers wrote short articles about his recovery. Local community groups shared his story as an example of resilience. Some people even came from other towns just to meet him, hoping his words would give them strength. Daniel never charged money for his talks or appearances. He always said, "If my pain can light someone else's path, then it was worth it." Despite the attention, Daniel remained the same humble man. He still sat with his mother in the evenings, drinking tea and sharing small stories. He still encouraged his brother to study and work hard, and whenever someone asked him how he endured 17 fractures, he gave the same answer with a smile: "I've had worse." Those words, once whispered weekly on a hospital bed, had now become a motto for his life. Over the years, Daniel's limp stayed, but so did his strength. He never returned to heavy construction work, but he found new purpose in guiding others. People often came to him when they were tired of life's struggles, and he always listened patiently before saying, "I know it hurts. I know it feels impossible. But trust me, if you hold on, you will rise again." In his town, Daniel became a symbol of human resilience. He showed everyone that courage is not about avoiding pain, but about facing it with an unbroken spirit. Children grew up hearing his story. Adults reminded each other of his journey, and even strangers carried his words with them. Though his body still carried the scars, Daniel lived each day with gratitude. He never forgot the accident, but instead of letting it define him as a victim, he turned it into proof of his strength. His story was not about how many times he was broken, but how many times he refused to stay down. And for the rest of his life, whenever someone asked how he managed to survive, he would smile, shake his head, and simply say, "I've had worse."